All right. Hey guys, so today in preparation for our study of the book of Revelation, chapter 1 is where we're starting. Right off the bat, we have a problem, and it's a problem that many people find with the idea of a futurist interpretation of Scripture or Bible prophecy. We're going to call it the problem of the delayed Parousia, Parousia referring to the second coming of Jesus. And so the problem was with the language soon, near, at hand, referring to the events of Bible prophecy or the return of Jesus. You know, it's been 2,000 years and it hasn't happened yet. So clearly it cannot mean soon from the writers of the Bible's perspective. It can't mean soon because it's been 2,000 years. And so we're going to deal with that problem. I want to read to you, this is Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. So right off the bat in Revelation, we have this problem. And so many people will try and make the point that Revelation, the things predicted and prophesied there have clearly already taken place because it says in the very first verse, the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. And so as we go through Revelation, it's going to use that vocabulary several other places. Soon, near, at hand, the events of the prophecy. And so we need to talk about what that means. There's what it says, and there's what it means. And a lot of times, when it comes to anything in the Bible, when you're talking about things written 2,000 years ago, or if you're talking about things in the Old Testament, it might have been like the Bronze Age. You know, there's a lot of work to get from what it originally meant to its original audience to what it means to us in the year 2020. And oftentimes there's a big gap between those two things that need to be closed. And so that's what we're going to do with this video. Let's go to our next slide here. Let's read from, first of all, 2 Peter chapter 3, and we're going to talk about this timing issue. It says, above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. And so there's a sense in which it's a form of scoffing to say that, well, since the Bible clearly says soon and it's not soon, it must mean something else. Let's keep reading what Peter says. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. In other words, that's just a metaphor, a form of speech saying time is completely different from God's perspective than from our perspective. Verse 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Again, from whose perspective? Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. In other words, God's waiting for just the right time. Now, if you're a cooker and you've got like a favorite dish, more often than not, you put that thing in the oven, you make sure the temperature's just right, and you need to pull that thing out of the oven at just the right time. Not too soon and not too late, but at just the right time. So if you skip down to verse 10, it says, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. It'll come suddenly and unexpectedly. And then verse 15, bear in mind that the Lord's patience means salvation. And so God is not being slow, he's being patient. And he is waiting for just the right time, the God-appointed time when everything is completed and in its proper place. Let's go to the next slide. Matthew 24:48. But suppose that a servant is wicked, referring to the timing of the Lord's return, and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And then he begins to beat his fellow servants, to eat and drink with drunkards, The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour when he is not aware. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In other words, there's an appointed time, and in the time period of waiting, people get the idea that, well, I can just do what I want, and begins to act and live however he wants, regardless of the consequences. And that type of for that type of person who isn't watching and waiting and assuming that it could happen anytime or soon, or it might be near, that person will be caught off guard, and the consequences will be very bad for a person like that. Let's look at a few Old Testament verses. Here's one thing we need to do when we're thinking about trying to interpret the New Testament, especially prophetic and apocalyptic literature draws heavily from the Old Testament. Most of the things you see in Revelation, you can find in the Old Testament in different places. And so we need to go back and see how the Old Testament uses this language, and that'll help us to understand what the New Testament means whenever it uses this language. So here's an example from Obadiah chapter 1, verse 15, where it's using that vocabulary of nearness. The day of the Lord, the day of judgment, is near for all nations. Now think about the time frame these are written. These are written, at the soonest 500 years before Jesus came the first time. 500 years. It can't mean soon or near in the way that we use soon or near. It cannot mean that. Here's Joel 3:14. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The time of judgment. It's the day of judgment, the final reckoning with God. Joel is using that language. The day of the Lord is near. Again, cannot mean near and soon in the way that we use that term in modern English language. Here's one more example. It's from the book of Zephaniah, verses 7 and 14. Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. Verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near. Near and coming quickly. And so here the Old Testament is using that same language, and clearly this concept, near, soon, at hand, conveys something different from how we use and understand the word in the modern English language. We've got to do some interpretive work to get from what it says, or how we translate ancient text, ancient vocabulary, into a modern language. There's a gap that we've got to close between what it says and what it means. It cannot mean like in a few days, or in a few months, or even in a few years, when we're talking about at minimum half a millennia. And so there's got to be some way to resolve this. I'm going to draw from a professor from Asbury, where I went to seminary. His name is Robert Mulholland Jr. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy, got his Doctor of Theology at Harvard Divinity School, and he was a professor emeritus at Asbury Theological Seminary. I'm going to draw from his commentary because he is going to unpack this language for us. This is from his commentary on the book of Revelation, and it's from chapter 1, verse 1. And so let's look at what he has to say. So he says similar expressions like this are found throughout the vision of Revelation. The places you'll find it specifically, Revelation 2:16, 3:11, 22:7, 22:12, and 22:20. Jesus promises that he is coming soon or quickly in 11:14. And the third woe is coming soon or quickly. Obviously, these promises of Revelation have not come to pass quickly or taken place soon from our perspective of time. So the translations soon or quickly are correct. In other words, he's saying that they are translating those words correctly. And in most New Testament instances are acceptable. What they don't take into account is the wider sphere of meaning of the word family from which the Greek term might come. So he's doing a study on this Greek term, And what he's saying, it means to order, to arrange, to appoint, to establish an order. And so if you look at the verses or the line circled down here, it indicates that the action described is to take place in order in the appointed time. In other words, there's no delay or contingency in God's purposes. They are always on schedule. And so the time frame that is being spoken of will happen at the appointed time. Nothing will keep it from happening at the appointed time. And when the appointed time comes, it will happen right on schedule. This interpretation is supported by the phrase in Revelation, the things necessary to take place, bound to happen. The Greek term is used of events that are ordained to take place in the scheme of things. Things that must take place quickly, therefore, can be more meaningfully translated, things that are bound to take place in the sequence of God's purpose. Whenever God's purpose comes to fruition and it's time for these things to happen, they will happen exactly when they're supposed to, how they're supposed to, right on time. And those who are watching and waiting will recognize it and be prepared. Those who are acting like, well, God's taking his time, I can do whatever I want, those people will be caught off guard. It will come like a thief upon them, and the consequences will be very bad. And so, in light of the fact of these things will definitely happen at their appointed time, and that time will catch those who aren't prepared by total surprise, and they'll have no time left to get ready once it happens. Once it happens, there isn't going to be any time to make some last-minute arrangements. They're going to have dire consequences they will have to face. The thought is we ought to live our lives as though that day will come at any moment, as though that day will come in the next hour, in the next day. We need to be prepared. And in 2 Peter, Peter goes on to advise us we ought to live holy lives pleasing to God. That's the number one way we prepare for these things that God is saying are going to come to pass. The number one way we prepare is to live upright and godly lives here and now, as though those things were going to happen tomorrow. Again, so that we'll not be ashamed or shrink back whenever he does appear, whenever he does come. We'll be prepared, we'll be excited, we'll be confident, and we'll be ready for whatever comes upon us. So that's just kind of a brief overview of how the New Testament, not only Revelation, but other prophetic books, what it means when it uses that term soon. That's one of the major critiques, again, of the futurist translation of Bible prophecy. But the critique doesn't hold up whenever you see it's used in the Old Testament like it is. Clearly, they're not using that word in the way that we use that word. Clearly, it means something different, and I hope this sheds some light on that for us. Thank you, guys, and hope to see you at class next Wednesday, where we'll cover chapter 1. Bye-bye. God bless.